Yo, what's up, guys? We finally got ourselves some interesting Leaf news, guys, and it is some big news, guys. The Leafs have finally found their GM, and they're bringing a familiar face along for the ride, guys. The Maple Leafs have fired John Chayka as their 19th general manager and franchise history, guys, and bringing in Matt Sundin to be an executive advisor, guys. We have finally found out now who will be taking the Maple Leafs forward, guys, into the new season, this new called era, so to speak, if you want. And it is very interesting news, and obviously a bit of a head scratcher with the decision of the hire, of course. There's a lot of skepticism, a lot of criticism in going into this hire, in hiring John Chayka. Of course, this man obviously has a bit of a checkered past, of course. Obviously managed the Arizona Coyotes, back then obviously being the Phoenix Coyotes from 2016 to 2020. Obviously was suspended, had some really bad things come to light about him during his tenure with the Coyotes, guys. But now he's 36 years old, 10 years older. But understandably so, why a lot of Leaf fans, including myself, will not understand why the Toronto Maple Leafs, a team, that has obviously made the playoffs for 9 straight years, missing the playoffs for the first time in over a decade. The Leafs really needed to bring in somebody that had a little bit of cachet, somebody with a lot more experience, I felt. Someone obviously with the names of like Doug Armstrong, of course, even a guy like Mike Gillis, obviously, whose name was all over the news, and his name completely disappeared from the radar, after a couple weeks of the news of John Chayka's name getting spread around. Mike Gillis's name completely fell off the radar, of course. So you had those two names there that would give you a little bit more reassurances. You had some assistant GMs like Scott White, Evan Gold, presumably with the Stars and the Bruins, of course. There was also Martin from the Rangers as well. So there were some names, that were out there. Of course, guys like White or Gold would have maybe been more reassuring. One of those guys was in Dallas for 18 years under a guy like Jim Nill. Of course, well, obviously extended, but obviously the Stars got eliminated in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs to the Minnesota Wild recently, so maybe he was looking for a change of scenery, but clearly the Maple Leafs decided to go in a different direction. Of course, now, I will say the positive and the negative first. Now, the positive I will say is that we are bringing home Matt Sundin, of course, former Maple Leaf captain, Leaf legend, of course, on Legends Row, second in all-time and leading goal scorer in Maple Leaf franchise history, guys. We obviously know that Matt Sundin knows what it takes, what it means to be a Toronto Maple Leaf, what the culture should be said, all those other things, right? But obviously there's a bit of skepticism in terms of his experience being in a type of role like this. So obviously Matt is a guy that doesn't have any experience in this role, somebody that's going to be new to the job. But I liked what he said at his presser today, somebody that gave you a little bit more reassurances, somebody that didn't even write anything down. The guy spoke straight from his chest, for God's sake. So with Matt Sundin being around, guys, obviously I understand, with having limited experience, but I just am a little bit more comfortable knowing that Matt Sundin is going to be working with John Chayka. If John Chayka was coming in as the GM by himself like Brad Treliving did 3 years ago, I would be absolutely incensed right now, losing my shit if John Chayka was coming in alone. But with Matt Sundin coming around, somebody to oversee him, bounce ideas off each other. Sundin and Chayka have clearly had a bit of a history before obviously being hired here by the Maple Leafs, knowing each other through London, meeting each other in London, through Ty Domi as well. Obviously, there was some chatter about Ty Domi having a little bit of a award or having some type of recommendation for John Chayka. Of course, even though the Maple Leafs had hired an agency, and there was obviously some controversy in the agency that they hired, the guy had worked under John Chayka, worked for John Chayka, and they end up coming up with his name. There's a lot of sketchy things going on with this guy and the hire, of course, and then you get someone like Steve Simmons shooting from the hip, saying things what he said to Keith Pelley about calling John Chayka, a liar, a con artist, saying he spoke to 20 people, 19 people, said it was a sham out of the 20. One guy had 1 vote of confidence, and Keith Pelley just stood there, not knowing what to say, stone-faced, saying, oh, we must have talked to different people. That did not give me any reassurance regarding Keith Pelley, and giving me any confidence knowing that John Chayka was the number 1 option for him. But clearly he is, and clearly Steve Simmons and a bunch of other people have an opinion about it. And it's very evident why they would, because of this man's previous history, of course, guys. So I understand why there's a lot of Leaf fans out there, very skeptical about this hire with John Chayka. I am very skeptical. It's going to have to be a wait-and-see type of situation with this guy. It's not very reassuring, with his history. Keith Pelly hasn't reassured any of us Leaf fans. The guy's just a bumbling idiot, if you guys ask me, just running his mouth, wanting to be in front of the spotlight, wanting to have his say, having a position of power. Of course, it's pretty evident that this guy clearly wants that, of course, so he thinks that John Chayka and him and Sundin can work as a collective. That's never worked before in professional sports. I watch another team in a different country, for God's sakes, that operates in a collective, and I'll tell you right now, it doesn't bloody work. You need a president, a GM, or a president, vice president, and then a GM to have these guys here with none of them having the head of hockey operations or GM or the president's role, to say the least. Even though Keith Pelly did say that it is John Chayka running hockey operations, to say the least. But very not a reassuring press conference, to say the least. A very uncomfortable one as well. With the tough questions, the Toronto media was really going in on John Chayka, asking him questions about his past, what he's going to do with certain things with Coach Berube. That's another topic of interest, guys. Of course, with Craig Berube saying that he's a great coach. Like I said in past videos, I would not be shocked if the Leafs kept Craig Berube around for next season, guys. It would not shock me at all, to say the least, guys. Now, talking about John Chayka, of course, let's talk a little bit about his history. Of course, I've been mentioning that the last couple minutes. Of course, Chayka, was an assistant GM, was hired by the Coyotes, promoted in 16 to the GM, guys. Was a GM for 4 years, had a record of 131, 147, and 38. The team technically qualified in a playoff berth for the first time since 2012 and 2020, but Chayka had resigned before the postseason had began. So technically he had a little bit of his fingerprints on the playoff team, but wasn't around when the team started, guys. Now, obviously, John Chayka has some strategic patterns here that Keith Pelly liked. Keith Pelly clearly stating that he's an analytical guy, is analytic driven, all that other shit. So seeing what I read here about John Chayka is clearly a big reason why Keith Pelly hired him. Has strategic patterns like buying low. Chayka would often target high pedigree players that were underperforming. Guys like Nick Schmaltz and Nick Cousins, for example. He would collect assets. He would focus on trading veterans. For example, guys like Mike Smith and Martin Hansel, who he had in Phoenix, of course, trying to accumulate draft picks and prospects. So that's good to see. You're trying to dump veterans, guys that can't produce you anymore, try to get some draft capital. Got nothing against that. He likes to trade. He's heavily influenced by data, of course, by a company that he co-founded called Staff Athletes. So ironically enough, Keith Pelly hiring a guy that created a bloody analytical damn website, for Christ's sakes, clearly gave Keith Pelly a hard on to hire this man, and I understand, hockey needs to be ran by guys who can make hockey decisions. Luckily enough, that's why I said having Matt Sundin around will obviously have that hockey sense, that hockey mentality, a hockey mind, of course, but obviously without having experience, his obvious experience on the ice will have to come into effect with behind the scenes, because Matt Sundin's obviously been in the NHL a long time, knows what it takes, like I mentioned, but now we obviously know why there's skepticism. John Chayka, of course, was suspended in 21. Phoenix had their couple draft picks taken away from them, a second and a first-round draft pick. Chayka, obviously, he had to depart. The NHL had revealed that the Coyotes had conducted an illegal physical testing of draft prospects. As a result, the team was forced to forfeit, like I just mentioned, 2020 second-round pick and a 2021 first-round pick. So obviously, that is some scathing shit to see, But of course, the Coyotes were obviously a mess, but that does not cover up the fact that John Chayka did what he did. That's an inexcusable thing to do. He clearly learned from it, like he said. He's obviously 10 years older, but obviously something to be a little bit worried about. He also abruptly re-signed his contract with 3 years remaining. It didn't make sense for him to do something like that just one day before the 2020 postseason. Those things there is why Steve Simmons says what he says, signing his contract. the NHL determined Chayka breached obligation to the club by pursuing other job opportunities, with the New Jersey Devils. So that's another scathing indictment on John Chayka, trying to find other jobs, of course, while still under contract with the Coyotes. So that's obviously another worrying thing that we hear about. Then scouting violations. They were found to having conducted illegal physical tests, like I mentioned, on 20 draft prospects. So like I said, 20 guys that they were doing that shit on. Like, that is just not good enough, man. That's just unacceptable for somebody who's running a professional hockey team. Cannot be doing that stuff, guys. Losing draft picks like that is completely inexcusable. Hopefully he learned from that, because I'm telling you guys right now, that shit ain't gonna fly here in Toronto, where he's in the center of the hockey universe. He knows now that shit cannot happen. Now, he made some okay trades, traded for a guy like Taylor Hall, of course, former Hart Trophy winner, traded for Phil Kessel. Nick Schmaltz was able to acquire Darcy Kemper, traded Derek Steffen and Antti Ranta, also traded Max Domi to the Habs, ironically enough. So those are some notable things that John Chayka did, guys, in Arizona's tenure. Now, like I said, those things are pretty bad. Did some okay trades. Obviously he's a young mind, an analytical mind, of course, like Keith Pelly wanted. But the question is, will Craig Berube be staying? What happens to the D-Corps? Will Morgan Riley be waiving his no-move clause? Will Berube be fired? That is obviously a big question mark. As of right now, I have no idea what's going to happen with Berube. I have no idea what's going to happen with Morgan Riley, because he controls his own destiny. All I know is that the Maple Leafs, have the lottery on tomorrow, guys, on Tuesday. If they can get their top 5 pick, that's already one little good thing, one positive thing in starting the tenure of Chayka and Sundin, of course, guys. So obviously, I completely understand the skepticism of this hire. I'm not crazy about this hire either. It's going to have to be a wait-and-see approach, guys. They still have to talk to Matthews. We still have to see the moves they make. We still have to see what happens with the draft lottery. Very concerning, what happened in the press today. Very uncomfortable as well. Keith Pelly, trying to obviously dodge a couple questions, of course, saying they did the due diligence a lot of the times. Stuff that doesn't reassure me. What will reassure me is what I see with the transactions, what they do at head coach, who they trade, who they sign, of course. That is obviously going to determine where these guys move as a hockey team, of course. Sundin's going to have a lot of say, of course. Now, Mats is taking a massive risk, of course, being obviously, like I mentioned, a former captain, a legend of this city and the team. He's putting his neck out on the line there, to come back, move his family to Toronto from Sweden, of course. Mats is really taking a massive risk here. If things go sideways here, this could really affect his legacy as a Toronto Maple Leaf. Everybody will love Mats as a player, but they will always remember, if things don't work out as an executive, you will always remember that, unfortunately. So I really hope to God that things can work out here for Matt Sundin and John Chayka. You obviously want things to work out, but obviously this hire here deserves some criticism, deserves some questioning, of course. The Leafs really needed somebody who can come in, cool off the flames a little bit, give the Leaf fans a little bit of hope and confidence. Instead, this hire here just makes fans a lot more nervous, a lot more edgy, including myself, not knowing what the future holds for this hockey team. And that's where Keith Pelly has failed to reassure the Leaf fan base that things are going in the right direction. And instead, he's taking a gamble, taking a risk, bringing in a guy like John Chayka with the checker pass, and bringing in a guy like Matt Sundin, who's obviously a former legend but has no experience. So this is an absolute major risk by the Maple Leafs, an absolute risk by Keith Pelly. This is his hire now. There is nothing protecting him anymore. If everything fails, everything is going to fall on Keith Pelly moving forward, guys. But really hope to God that Sundin and Chayka go in there, hopefully to God, doing the right things that can turn this franchise around in one season, of course. You have some guys like Matthews, Nylander, Nyes. Of course, John Tavares had a really positive season. Chris Tanev obviously came off an injury-riddled season, of course, only playing 11 games. Of course, Jake McCabe had the most blocks in this season, of course. So, you're going to have guys like McCabe, Tanev, Ekman Larson, of course. Their job for me, guys, is to get rid of guys like, of course, Morgan Riley, get rid of Brandon Carlo if you can, get rid of guys like Robertson, Yarncrook's a free agent, of course. I don't know if they're going to sign Michelli. He's a restricted free agent. But this Maple Leafs team, guys, I think we'd all agree, Matthews and Nylander said it, they need to get bigger, more bite, more stronger on the back end there. You know, so there's a lot of things, guys, that these men need to do. There's a lot of pressure on Matt Sundin and John Chayka now to succeed in this organization. And Keith Pelly at the forefront of it all, guys. He has not calmed the waters, and instead, he's caused more waves than anything, guys. I understand why Leaf fans, and including myself, are skeptical about this hire. I'm not crazy about this hire. When I heard John Chayka's name come out, I'm saying to myself, this man hasn't been in the NHL for the last 6 seasons. So I completely understand it, guys. It's going to have to be a wait-and-see thing. I did the same thing with Bradford leaving, even though I was skeptical with him as well. Didn't like how we handled, not trading Johnny Gaudreau, letting him walk for free. Obviously, he had to trade Matthew Tkachuk because he told him he was going to walk. And then we saw him trade for Huberdeau and Weegar. Huberdeau's obviously been a mess after signing that massive contract. Hasn't been nowhere near the player he was in Florida and Calgary. And then Weegar obviously waived his no-move clause in Calgary to go to Utah, of course, now, guys. So Treliving didn't work out. I waited and saw. They won the division 1 year. He ended up making a mess, obviously, possibly trading a top 5 pick, of course. It's going to have to be the same thing with Sundin and Chayka, guys. I obviously have my reservations, of course. We're going to have to wait and see, though, guys. It's going to have to be up for debate where these two lead the Toronto Maple Leafs. We're going to find out very quick, though, in the next couple of years, guys, where this Maple Leafs team goes. They're either going to go in the right direction, start competing again, hopefully try to compete for a cup, or we're going to see this Maple Leaf team, guys, completely destroyed. Matthews and Nylander walking out the door. Tavares maybe retiring, walking out the door, and having to watch another possible rebuild for another 5 to 10 years. And I'm not prepared for that. I'm honestly not, guys. So we'll love to hear, guys, thoughts and opinions on the hiring of Matt Sundin and John Chayka. I'm a little bit more comfortable that Matt is around, obviously knowing what it takes to be a Toronto Maple Leaf, guys. John Chayka is obviously up for debate, of course. He's going to have to go out there and prove it with the moves he makes, the hirings he makes as well. We'll see what he does with Craig Berube, Morgan Rielly, of course. We'll see what Matt Sundin has up his sleeves in terms of what he wants to do, having his 2 cents involved in the organization now, guys. And I would love to not see Keith Pelly's face as much as possible for the next year. Keep that guy out of the limelight. Let Sundin and Chayka do their job. And then we'll see what happens, guys. With the lottery tomorrow, we'll be making a video about that, of course, if the Leafs do or do not get the top 5 pick, guys. Who I want the Leafs to possibly draft, of course. And then we'll go from there, and then we'll see what happens in free agency. The Stanley Cup playoffs have been interesting as well. Just the Tampa Bay Lightning, man. You guys make me bloody sick. You let that team beat you with only 10 shots on freaking net. God damn it, man. You guys make me sick. But, guys, we'll love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions on the hirings of John Chayka and Matt Sundin. We'll love to hear your thoughts and opinions on how you guys feel with Keith Pelly as well, because I think that guy there is just nothing but a bloody pencil pusher, to say the least, guys. But we'll love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions, guys. Thank you very much for watching, as always, guys. So like this video, subscribe if you guys want to see more content. Go Leafs, go as always, guys. We'll see you guys on the next episode of Leafs Unfiltered. Ciao, guys.